100 factories, 6,000 workers, 75,000 pianos a year, hand-built in Camden and Kentish Town from timber seasoned for 7 years, assembled from over 2,500 parts, and sold to a nation that believed every respectable home should have one. The parlour piano was the centre of British family life. Courtship, worship, entertainment, pride, all of it gathered around a single instrument. Then the wars took the craftsmen. The gramophone, the radio, and the television took the audience. And Yamaha took the market, building more pianos in a single Japanese factory than all of Britain's manufacturers combined. One by one, the London factories closed. The names were sold. The buildings became luxury flats and yoga studios. Today, here the sole surviving British piano manufacturer operates from converted cowsheds in the Yorkshire Dales. 8 craftspeople. And across the country, the pianos those Camden factories built, beautiful, handcrafted, unwanted, are being broken up for firewood, because nobody wants them anymore. This is the story of how Britain made music for the world, and then forgot how. Chapter 1. The Walk from Devon. The story begins on a road. A long one. Sometime in 1835, a 21-year-old from the village of Weir Gifford in Devon, son of an innkeeper and lime burner, trained as a carpenter, previously a shepherd, set out on foot for London. His name was John Brinsmead. He walked approximately 200 miles. He had no factory waiting for him, no connections in the trade, no capital worth mentioning. What he had was a pair of hands that understood wood and an ambition that his home county couldn't accommodate. He found work almost immediately. London's piano trade was hungry for men who could shape timber, and Brinsmead was good at it. Within a year of arriving, he'd set up his own workshop at 35 Windmill Street, off Tottenham Court Road. A single room in the heart of London's furniture-making district, where the smell of freshly planed walnut and the rasp of handsaws were as constant as the traffic outside. He wasn't building complete pianos yet. He was making cases, the outer shells, the cabinet work. But he was watching, learning how the instrument inside the case was put together, and planning. By the 1870s, that single room had become a 61,000 square foot factory on Grafton Road in Kentish Town, over 300 workers, and 2,000 pianos a year. Brinsmead walked each day between his home near Regent's Park, his factory in Kentish Town, and his showrooms on Wigmore Street, a triangle of approximately 4 miles that he covered on foot, daily until he was 90 years old. He ruled his employees with what one contemporary account calls a will of iron. He died in 1908, aged 93. Both his sons had predeceased him. The empire outlived the dynasty that built it, but not by much. Brinsmead wasn't alone. He wasn't even first. But his trajectory, provincial outsider, craft training, single-minded tenacity, and a very particular patch of North London, was the template. The men who built Britain's piano industry arrived from the margins and converged on the same few square miles, as drawn by forces they didn't fully understand and couldn't have predicted. Frederick William Collard, baptised in 1772 in Wivliscombe, Somerset, came to London at 14 and joined the piano-making firm of Longman, Lukey and Broderick at 26 Cheapside. He turned out to be something close to a mechanical genius, securing multiple patents for piano improvements. When the original firm collapsed and was reconstituted under the famous composer-pianist Muzio Clementi, the Collard brothers gradually took control. By 1832, the firm was Collard and Collard, and by the 1850s they'd built something extraordinary on Oval Road in Camden Town. A circular factory called the Rotunda, designed by Thomas and William Piper, with 52 bays, 22 windows fitted with workbenches, and a central open well where pianos were hoisted between floors by lift. Timber dried at the lowest level. Uprights were assembled above. Cleaning, polishing, and soundboard manufacture rose upward through the stories. It was an industrial cathedral, purpose-built for the making of one thing. It still stands today, Grade 1 listed, the highest level of heritage protection. It houses offices. Wilhelm Dahnemann arrived from a different direction entirely. Born around 1864 in Wittenberg, Germany, he came to London as a furniture designer and architect, trained under Brinsmead, and might have spent his career working for other men's firms. But then came the twist that launched a dynasty. Commissioned to design cases for another piano company, a Danaman arrived to deliver his work and collect his fee, only to find the firm had entered receivership. They couldn't pay him. Rather than writing off the loss, Daneman negotiated with the liquidators. He bought the failed company, offsetting the purchase price against what he was owed. By 1893, he'd established the Daneman Piano Works at Northampton Street, Islington. 3 generations of his family would build instruments there until 1983. And then there was Alfred Edward Knight, born in 1898 at 99 Camberwell Road, a working-class Londoner whose great-great-grandfather had worked in the Broadwood workshop when it was still at Westminster. Knight attended West Square Central Boys' School in Southwark, showed talent for wood and metal work. And in 1931, during the worst of the Great Depression, when sane men were hoarding what they had, set up Booker and Knight at a factory in Carrisford Road, Stoke Newington. By 1935, he'd bought out his partner. By 1939, he was making 1,000 pianos a year. He was described as a bustling, cheerful Londoner with a brisk line in chat, a consummate salesman, as well as a fine craftsman. 4 generations of Knights in the piano trade. From Broadwood's Georgian workshop to Alfred's OBE in 1966. The craft ran in the blood. A shepherd from Devon, a boy from Somerset, a German architect, a Camberwell craftsman's son. Provincial outsiders and immigrant makers, all drawn to the same corner of London. None of them could have known that within a few decades their factories would form the densest concentration of piano manufacturing anywhere on earth. End Chapter 2. The Empire on the Canal. The question isn't why London had a piano industry. London had everything. The question is why Camden Town, Kentish Town and Islington, those particular streets, that precise geography, became the piano manufacturing capital of the world. And the answer begins with water. The Regent's Canal was the foundational advantage. Piano manufacturing consumed vast quantities of heavy timber. Spruce from Scandinavia, maple from North America, beech and walnut from English forests, rosewood from the tropics, and produced finished instruments weighing several hundred pounds each. Moving raw materials in and finished pianos out demanded cheap, reliable, bulk transport. The canal provided it. Barges carried timber from London's docks directly to the factory doors along the towpath, and carried crated pianos back out to the national canal system and the export markets beyond. But the canal was only the start. Camden sat between 3 of London's great railway termini, King's Cross, Euston and St Pancras, ideal for dispatching pianos to customers the length and breadth of Britain. The Midland Main Line ran alongside the Brinsmead and Imperial Works factories. Local stations at Chalk Farm and Gospel Oak provided additional rail connections. Raw materials in by water. Finished pianos out by rail. The logistics were close to perfect. The furniture trade completed the triangle. Piano manufacturing had originally clustered around Tottenham Court Road and Fitzrovia, near London's established furniture-making district. As firms expanded, they migrated northward to Camden, where industrial space was cheaper and the transport was better. But the furniture district's legacy travelled with them, a ready pool of skilled woodworkers who understood joinery, veneering and French polishing, and who could transition to piano casework without starting from scratch. Once Brinsmead and Collard established their factories, the ecosystem fed itself. Specialist suppliers clustered nearby, creating a web of interdependence so intricate that no single firm could easily have relocated without losing access to dozens of critical trades. Jack Whitehead, the local historian whose grandfather John Sandon was himself a Camden piano maker, catalogued what grew up around the factories. Piano key makers, wrench pin makers, sellers of key leads, hammer coverers, incisors who cut the fretted wooden fronts, truss carvers, gilders, marquetry workers, French polishers, veneer and timber and ivory suppliers, makers of piano casters, candle sconce makers, piano stool makers, music cabinet makers, piano back makers, piano movers, piano storers, tuners and salesmen. All of them earning a living in and around Camden town and along the canal. German immigrant craftsmen were woven into the ecosystem from the beginning. The most historically significant early pianoforte designs had appeared in London in the 1760s, mostly the work of immigrant German-born craftsmen, men like Johannes Zumpe from Fürth, who is credited with inventing the English pianoforte. That tradition never entirely faded. Siegmund Heckscher established a piano parts supply business at 75 Bayham Street, Camden Town in 1883, and operating from what the Ham and High newspaper would later describe as a Dickensian warehouse. His descendants ran the business from the same premises until 2017, the very last piano-related company to leave Camden. Herberger, Brooks at 31 Lime Street were the world's oldest established maker of piano actions, founded in 1810 by Henry Brooks. They supplied the mechanisms that sat inside cases made by a dozen different firms, all within walking distance. The major firms mapped onto specific streets. Collard & Collard on Oval Road. Brinsmead dominating Grafton Road. Chappell & Co. between Belmont Street and Ferdinand Street, near the Roundhouse. Hopkinson at 44 Fitzroy Road, where an ornate Italianate-style portico with piano-shaped gates still marks the site. Challen on Archer and Kernock Street. And the Imperial Piano and Organ Company, occupying the Imperial Works on Perrin Street, a Gothic-style Victorian building in polychromatic brickwork. Monington and Weston at Piercefield Street. Allison and Allison at Preben Street. The Italian immigrant Giuliano Agello building pianos at 104 Park Street. By 1910, more than 100 piano-related factories and workshops operated within these streets, employing up to 6,000 people. The 1911 census recorded 136 piano makers in Britain. All but 3 manufactured in London. And as Whitehead observed, the district contained both Wales and minnows. At one end, Brinsmead's vast Grafton Works, with its hundreds of employees and thousands of instruments a year. At the other, small assembly shops in back kitchens where parts were bought in ready-made from the specialist suppliers down the road, assembled by a handful of workers, and the boss could sometimes be seen on a Friday afternoon hawking a finished piano round the district, hoping to sell it for £20 cash to cover the wages and the rent. That was Camden's piano quarter. Not a planned industrial zone. Not a government scheme. A thing that grew from the canal, the railways, the timber yards, the furniture makers, the German immigrants, and the simple gravitational logic of skilled trades clustering where skills already existed. A living, breathing, self-reinforcing ecosystem of craft and commerce that happened to produce instruments capable of filling a concert hall with sound, or filling a terraced house parlour with something closer to joy. And Chapter 3. The Household Orchestra and God. The factories existed because of a hunger. And the hunger wasn't for pianos, not really, it was for respectability. Between the 1840s and 1910, the piano underwent a transformation unique in the history of any manufactured object. It evolved from an aristocratic luxury, the preserve of the wealthy, the musically trained, the leisured, into the supreme symbol of British middle-class aspiration. The economic historian Cyril Ehrlich, who wrote the definitive account of the industry, called the piano the household orchestra and God. He wasn't exaggerating. UK piano production rose from approximately 23,000 instruments per year in 1850 to roughly 75,000 per year by 1910. Worldwide, the 4 main producing nations, Britain, the United States, Germany, and France, were together manufacturing some 600,000 pianos annually by the Edwardian era. An estimated 2 to 4 million pianos sat in British homes at the industry's peak. That's a piano in roughly a quarter to a third of all middle-class and upper-working-class households. Think about that for a moment. Not gramophones, not wireless sets. Pianos, large, heavy, expensive instruments requiring years of practice to play competently, regular tuning to maintain, and a dedicated corner of the parlour to accommodate. And families wanted them with an intensity that bordered on compulsion. The social forces driving that want were powerful and interlocking. Playing the piano was virtually required for marriageable young women. It demonstrated breeding, leisure, and moral discipline in a single accomplishment. The Reverend H.R. Haweis, writing in 1871, believed the cottage piano had done more to bring peace and happiness to families than all the homilies on domestic virtues ever penned. Playing duets, especially four-hand piano arrangements, was one of the few respectable ways for young men and women to sit close together in a drawing room. The piano was simultaneously entertainment, education, courtship aid, status symbol, and devotional instrument. It carried more social weight than any single object in the Victorian home, and if you couldn't afford one outright, there was a solution for that. Hire purchase was essentially invented to sell pianos. By 1850, cottage pianos could be hired for £1 a month. By 1884, pianos for the million were advertised at 10 guineas, roughly £1,300 in today's money. Alongside sewing machines and farm equipment, says pianos became one of the earliest consumer goods sold on credit. It was this financial innovation, the instalment plan, the monthly payment, that transformed the piano from an aspiration into a reality for the expanding lower middle class and even some skilled working class families. The factory workers of Camden were building instruments that other working families were buying on hire purchase, a few shillings a week, an investment in their children's futures and their own standing in the street. The sheet music publishing industry fed the hunger from the other direction. Chappell and Co., Boosey and Sons, Novello and Argonair published an enormous volume of popular music, drawing room ballads, operatic arrangements, hymns, dance music, all designed for amateur performance at home. Boosey's London ballad concerts at St James's Hall, where running from 1867 were specifically designed to promote sheet music sales. Arthur Sullivan's The Lost Chord was a massive commercial hit. The entire popular music industry before the gramophone depended on amateur pianists buying printed music and performing it in their parlours. Every sheet sold was a reason to keep the piano tuned. Every new song was a reason to sit down and play. And it wasn't just the parlour. By 1886, a significant proportion of the 35,000 pianos produced annually in England went to pubs and music halls. The pub pianist became an established occupation, sometimes hazardous, often poorly paid, but always in demand. The piano was everywhere. It accompanied worship on Sunday mornings and drinking on Saturday nights. It was the background to courtship and the soundtrack to mourning. It was the one instrument that could carry a melody, provide its own harmony, and fill a room without amplification. Camden's factories supplied all of it. Every parlour, every pub, every music hall, every church. The hunger was insatiable, and the factories hummed. Chapter 4. 2,000 parts and a will of iron. A piano contains over 2,500 individual parts. A cast iron frame weighing approximately 600 pounds. Between 220 and 240 strings under enormous tension. 88 keys. An action mechanism with thousands of moving components, hammers, dampers, whippins, jacks, repetition levers, all of which must function with a precision measured in fractions of a millimetre. Making one required dozens of specialised skills and months of patient work. At Brinsmead's peak, 300 to 400 pianos were in simultaneous production at any given time, and each at a different stage of its journey from raw timber to finished instrument. A young worker arriving for his first shift would have entered a world of layered sensation. The smell hit you first, the rich, complex scent of multiple varieties of aged timber in various states of transformation. Spruce for soundboards selected for its elasticity and a grain pattern of approximately 10 annual growth rings per inch. Rock maple for pin blocks and rims. Beech for structural elements. Hornbeam for hammers. Walnut, mahogany, rosewood or cherry for the exterior veneer. Each wood had its own character, its own fragrance and its own demands on the craftsman working it. The process began with timber seasoning, the most patient stage of all. The J. Spencer and Company factory behind Chalcot Road had a timber drying shed where wood was seasoned for 7 years. 7 years of waiting before a single cut was made. When Jack Whitehead cleared out one of the last Camden piano factories around 1970, he found offcuts of American black walnut and mature Japanese oak, which had been seasoning for over 30 years. They cut, he said, like butter. Soundboard spruce was air-dried for 6 months to 2 years, then kiln-dried to precise moisture content. The timber alone represented an investment in time that no modern manufacturing process would tolerate. Then came the acrid reek of heated animal glue from the glue boiling rooms, the adhesive that held cases together, fixed soundboards to frames and bonded veneer to casework. The volatile sweetness of French polish, applied by hand in dedicated polishing departments where workers built up layer after layer of shellac dissolved in alcohol, rubbing each coat until it gleamed. The omnipresent wood dust, fine as talcum in the sanding rooms, coarse and curled where the lathes and saws operated. The clanging of cast iron frames being fitted to cases, 600 pounds of metal, precision cast and carefully positioned. The skeleton around which the strings would be stretched. And underneath it all, if you stood in the right spot, you could feel the building itself vibrate with the constant activity of hundreds of hands working hundreds of instruments toward completion. They were also dangerous places. Due to the nature of piano manufacturing, steam-powered machinery, seasoned timber, varnish, wood dust, and heated animal glue, fires were an occupational hazard. The most spectacular struck Collard & Collard's newly completed rotunda on December 10, 1851. In the early hours, watchmen at Camden goods station spotted flames. The very architectural features designed for efficient manufacture, the open central well, 2 staircases and 88 windows, created a catastrophic chimney effect. The fire produced an immense sheet of flames that, according to contemporary accounts, illuminated the whole of London. Despite drawing extra water from the Regent's Canal, firemen lost control. The building was gutted, 200 finished instruments destroyed. It was rebuilt within the year, because the demand for pianos wouldn't wait. John Malcolm and Company's factory on Erskine Road caught fire on 21 March 1906, was restored at a cost of £9,000, and then caught fire again 5 months later. The factories burned and were rebuilt, burned and were rebuilt. The hunger for what they made was stronger than the flames. The workforce was predominantly male, highly specialised, and often hereditary. The 1881 census recorded nearly 6,500 men, women and children in approximately 400 piano-related occupations across 42 English counties, the majority in London. Broadwood alone employed 629 men and 67 boys. Census records identify children as young as 10 in the trade. George A. Ayling, born around 1871, listed in St Pancras as working in pianoforte, makers. 10 years old, learning a craft that would take a decade to master. Women were there too, though their roles were often invisible in the records. A photograph captioned, "Women workers at the Brinsmead Piano Factory, Kentish Town," confirms their presence on the factory floor. The 1921 census recorded 143 female piano action makers, fitters and assemblers in the UK. Miss Ada Harper was described as the only woman piano manufacturer and managing director in England at Thomas Harper Pianos Limited. During the Second World War, women's roles expanded significantly as men were called up. They were trained to run glue presses, assemble cases, and carry out inspection work that had previously been an exclusively male preserve. Family dynasties defined the culture. The Brinsmeads spanned multiple generations, and eventually fracturing when John Brinsmead fired his nephew Thomas Edward and Sons in 1895 for allegedly making pianos on company time, provoking a bitter legal battle over use of the family name. The Collards passed the business through several generations. The Grovers, founders of Bentley pianos, sustained 5 generations in the trade. The Knights spanned 4 generations from Broadwood's Westminster workshop to Alfred's honour in 1966. These weren't just businesses, they were bloodlines. The community around the factories had its own rhythms and institutions. The Mother Redcap pub, now the World's End, a Wetherspoons by Camden Station, served as what the piano historian Alistair Lawrence called a virtual labour exchange for the piano industry. And the factories would come to hire both skilled and unskilled workers who gathered there hoping to pick up work. The surrounding neighbourhood was defined by Victorian terraced housing, the Regent's Canal, and the constant movement of timber, iron, and finished pianos along streets built for horse-drawn carts. Erskine Mews housed the stables for horses that towed raw materials from canal and railway to factory door. The works hooter marked the shifts. The pub marked the end of the week. The rhythm was steady, familiar, and seemingly permanent. British piano makers innovated too, though their conservatism would later prove fatal in ways none of them could yet imagine. Brinsmead secured numerous patents for improved escapement actions and novel tuning pin designs. Dynaman introduced the distinctive back bridge feature in the 1930s. Knight pioneered the use of nylon impregnated with glass fibre and graphite for piano actions, a genuine technical advance that improved durability and consistency. But the most extraordinary technical feat came from Challen. In 1935, to mark the silver jubilee of King George V, the company built 2 pianos measuring 11 feet 8 inches long and weighing over 2,000 pounds, confirmed for decades by the Guinness Book of Records as the world's largest pianos. Painted silver, the first was displayed at the British Industries Fair, inspected by Queen Mary, and played by the virtuoso Billy Mayle. The second, later refinished in gold, toured exhibition halls and recording studios. It was showmanship of the highest order, but it was also a statement. We can build anything. We are the best in the world. And for a time, that was true. Decades later, Challen's studio upright, the so-called jangle box, would achieve a kind of immortality that no one in the Archer Street factory could have predicted. Abbey Road Studios purchased one in 1964 for £250. The Beatles used it on Tomorrow Never Knows, Paperback Writer, The Fool on the Hill, and Old Brown Shoe. The Zombies, Pink Floyd, John Barry and Matt Monro all played it. Cigarette burns remain visible to the left of the keys, quite possibly, Abbey Road notes, courtesy of John or Paul. A piano built in a Camden side street, played on records that changed the world. That's what these factories made. Chapter 5. The Summit. Nobody questioned. The absolute peak arrived in the years immediately before the First World War, roughly 1910 to 1913. Production reached approximately 75,000 pianos per year. Over 200 manufacturers were in operation across Britain, though the overwhelming majority were concentrated in London. Every self-respecting household had a piano, or wanted one. The industry appeared unassailable. The prestige was immense. Brinsmead held royal warrants as pianoforte makers to HRH the Prince of Wales from 1883, with additional warrants from the Kings of Portugal and Bavaria. Broadwood held the royal warrant continuously since George II, the longest-serving warrant of its kind. Knight pianos achieved the distinction of being the only brand displayed alongside Steinway's own instruments in Steinway Hall, London. These weren't just instruments, they were ambassadors. On Grafton Road, Brinsmead's 400-strong workforce produced their weekly 60 instruments. On Oval Road, a Collard's Rotunda turned out 40 pianos a week. In 1911, Michael Kemble founded yet another piano company in Stoke Newington, the very last manufacturer to enter an industry that was, though nobody knew it, approaching its zenith. The Mother Redcap overflowed with workers. The steel tracks set into the cobblestones of Perrin Street rang with the trolleys carrying finished instruments to the railways. The timber yards were full. The order books were full. The future, by every measure anyone cared to use, was full. But the peak contained warnings that would only become visible in retrospect. Broadwood, the oldest and most prestigious name in the trade, did not make its first overstrung piano until 1897. Overstringing was an innovation of the late 1830s, That's a 60-year lag in adopting a fundamental technical advance. Metal frames had been, as one historian noted, long and incorrectly held to give inferior tone to wood. This wasn't simply a business misjudgment. It was a cultural orientation embedded in the industry's identity, the preference for tradition over innovation, for piano maker rather than piano manufacturer. The men who ran these firms saw themselves as craftsmen, not industrialists. That distinction would prove fatal. There was a second vulnerability, less visible but equally dangerous. By the early 20th century, dozens of upstart manufacturers had begun building cheap, inferior instruments to capture the lower end of the market, featuring elaborate casework that looked impressive but disguised poor tone and shoddy construction. These flooded the market and damaged the industry's collective reputation. While the very success that had spawned 100 factories had also spawned the conditions that would, decades later, make Japanese imports so devastating. When the competition finally arrived, British piano making would be undermined from within as much as from without. None of this was apparent in 1913. The pianos kept rolling down Perrin Street. The trolleys kept running on their steel tracks. The mother redcap kept serving pints to men whose hands smelled of French polish and animal glue. And somewhere in Hamamatsu, Japan, a company called Yamaha, founded in 1887 by a man who'd started by repairing a broken reed organ, was quietly producing its first grand pianos. Nobody in Camden noticed. Nobody in Camden had any reason to. The summit felt permanent, summits always do. And Chapter 6. The Wars that Broke the Chain. The First World War struck the piano industry with a force from which it never fully recovered. At Brinsmead, nearly 100 men signed up for Kitchener's army in 1914. By the war's end, 70% of the workforce had gone. The government rationed wood and metal, considered piano making non-essential. In 1917, the Grafton Road factory was converted for munitions and aircraft construction. Half-finished pianos were stockpiled pending the war's end. Many of the craftsmen who'd been building them would never return. The aftermath was brutal and swift. The post-war introduction of the minimum wage, replacing the piecework system that had been standard in the trade for generations, dramatically increased costs overnight. Workers and management turned on each other. Its workers cited inferior wood and inexperienced post-war management, too many skilled men dead or broken. Management blamed trade unions and the creeping return of German competition. On the evening of the 4th of February 1920, the 300 employees of Brinsmead's Grafton Road factory were told the decision had been made to close. 1 week's notice. The company that John Brinsmead had walked 200 miles to build, that had grown from a single room on Windmill Street to a 61,000 square foot works, employing hundreds. Bankrupt. On the 16th of March 1921, the receiver auctioned 100 pianos for between £62 and £144 each. The freehold was sold. The name was acquired by J.B. Kramer and Company. But as the Brinsmead family history records, the pianos produced after 1920 were Brinsmead pianos in name only. These, the first great name of Camden's piano quarter, was dead. The ecosystem it had helped create still functioned, the specialist suppliers, the timber yards, the action makers, but the web had lost a major thread. The Second World War was even more disruptive to the craft itself, though several firms turned their woodworking expertise to remarkable wartime use. Piano factories possessed exactly the capabilities military production demanded. Heavy castings, accurate machining, complex woodworking. The de Havilland Mosquito, a fast twin-engine aircraft built largely of wood with balsa core and birch skins, was designed specifically to utilise cabinet-making skills. Firms including the Stroud Piano Company, Knight, Barrett and Robinson, and Kemble produced laminated fuselage shells, wing ribs and bulkheads. And the Stroud Piano Company made parts for the Gloucester Meteor, Britain's first operational jet fighter. Piano action technicians who had spent years regulating delicate hammer mechanisms were retrained to build radio and radar assemblies. Hands that had tuned strings were now wiring circuits. Piano production was effectively halted by the Board of Trade in 1943. Raw materials, timber, iron, steel, wool for hammer felt, copper for bass strings, were all strictly rationed. Limited runs were authorised for NAFI canteens and forces clubs, but that was all. The war lasted 6 years. 6 years of interrupted craft transmission in an industry that depended on long apprenticeships and bench-to-bench skill transfer. The old hand showing the young one how to voice a hammer, how to feel when a soundboard was properly tensioned, how to judge the grain of a piece of spruce by running a thumbnail across it. Frank Challen, as secretary to the Piano Manufacturers Association, had tried before the war to establish trade schools for piano design and evening classes at the Northern Polytechnic in Holloway Road. The war destroyed what remained of the apprenticeship pipeline before it could be rebuilt. And not everyone came back. Aircraft and engineering firms offered more attractive employment, better wages, more modern conditions, the prestige of an industry that was growing rather than shrinking. The skills ecology that had sustained Camden's piano quarter for half a century was fractured. Not destroyed outright. Fractured. The distinction matters. A fractured thing can still function. It just can't absorb the next blow as well. The next blows were already on their way. Chapter 7. The technologies that silenced the parlour. The gramophone arrived first. Spring-powered record machines entered wealthier homes from the 1900s, offering something the piano couldn't. Professional music, available on demand, without the need for years of practice. The gramophone initially coexisted with the piano. Many households owned both, but it introduced a conceptual shift that would prove irreversible. The shift from making music to listening to it. From active performance to passive consumption. It seemed harmless enough. A supplement, not a replacement. But it planted a seed. Radio accelerated the change. The BBC began broadcasting in 1922. By the mid-1930s, wireless sets were common in British homes. Professional orchestras, concert pianists, variety entertainment. All of it piped directly into the parlour. No sheet music required, no practicing scales for months to play a simple ballad. The cultural expectation that a family would make its own music, the expectation on which an entire industry had been built, began quietly to dissolve. Television completed the transformation. Regular BBC broadcasts resumed after the war. Mass adoption was driven by the 1953 coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, the event that put a screen in millions of living rooms. By the mid-1950s, television was becoming the dominant form of home entertainment. BBC Two launched in 1964. Colour transmissions began in 1967. The parlour piano, once the focal point of family evenings, was now competing with a screen. It was a competition the piano was never going to win. Post-war housing compounded the problem in ways that were purely physical. British houses built after 1945 were significantly smaller than their Victorian predecessors. The terraced houses that had accommodated cottage uprights gave way to semis and council flats with lower ceilings and narrower rooms. There was simply less space for a full-sized upright piano. British manufacturers responded by pioneering the small modern upright in the 1960s, compact cases without bulky front legs. But they were fighting against the physics of acoustics. Smaller pianos meant compromised sound. The instrument was shrinking to fit homes that hadn't been designed with it in mind. Central heating, adopted en masse in the 1960s and 1970s, inflicted a final indignity. The dry air of centrally heated rooms warped soundboards, buckled frames, and made older instruments impossible to keep in tune. The very technology that made British homes more comfortable made their pianos unplayable. Families who'd inherited grandmother's cottage upright found it drifting further out of tune each winter, until one year they simply stopped calling the tuner. The piano became furniture. Then it became an obstruction. Then it became a problem. Each of these technologies, gramophone, radio, television, smaller houses, central heating, removed another reason to own an acoustic piano. None of them killed the industry on its own. Together, they hollowed out the market that Camden's factories depended on. The hunger that had driven production to 75,000 instruments a year was fading. And while the hunger faded, something else was growing. something that would destroy not just the desire for British pianos, but the capacity to make them. Chapter 8. The tsunami from Hamamatsu Yamaha had been founded in 1887 by Torakusu Yamaha in Hamamatsu, Japan, initially as a reed organ manufacturer. The company produced its first upright piano in 1900 and its first grand in 1902. For decades, it was a regional concern, significant in Japan, invisible everywhere else. Then Junichi Kawakami became president in 1950. And everything changed. Kawakami invested in revolutionary kiln drying techniques that reduced timber seasoning from years to weeks. He automated manufacturing processes that British firms still performed by hand. He built enormous purpose-built factories where every component, actions, keyboards, hammers, frames, soundboards, and strings, was manufactured in-house to exacting and consistent standards. By 1965, Yamaha was producing more pianos than any other manufacturer in the world. By 1966, output exceeded 100,000 instruments per year. One company, producing more pianos annually than Britain's entire industry had managed at its Edwardian peak. Kawai followed the same trajectory. Founded in 1927 by Koichi Kawai, who had been an apprentice to Yamaha's founder from the age of 11, the company reached production of more than 5,000 pianos per month by the late 1970s. Kawai pioneered the use of ABS composite materials from 1971 for action parts, overcoming the humidity problems inherent in wooden actions. It was a technical innovation that British makers simply never matched. The difference in manufacturing philosophy was not subtle, it was a chasm. Japanese manufacturers operated vast, highly automated factories with rigorous quality control at every stage. British manufacturers continued relying on traditional handcraft methods and third-party component suppliers, buying actions from Herberger Brooks, keys from one specialist, hammers from another, adding cost at every junction and reducing quality control to whatever could be checked at final assembly. The Japanese made everything under one roof. The British assembled parts made by a dozen different firms in a dozen different workshops scattered along the Regent's Canal. One approach was an industrial system. The other was a medieval guild that hadn't noticed the century had turned. The price gap was devastating. Japanese pianos offered comparable or superior quality at significantly lower prices. As one industry observer noted, people discovered they could get a grand piano, or a good tall upright, for a fraction of the price of a Western equivalent. British piano prices had become too high for the quality on offer. There was no apparent innovation for potential buyers to justify paying the premium, whereas manufacturers in Japan were actively building better pianos, better actions, better consistency, better tone, for less money. The value proposition collapsed. Korean manufacturers then attacked from below. Samik, founded in 1958, and Youngchang, founded in 1956, entered the British market in the 1980s with budget instruments that undercut even Japanese prices. Youngchang created the Weber brand specifically for English-speaking markets where a Korean name might deter purchasers. And the practice of rebranding budget pianos with fictitious or long-extinct European names became commonplace. British manufacturers were squeezed from above by Japanese quality, and from below by Korean, and, increasingly, Chinese prices. The space in between, the space where British pianos had lived for a century, simply ceased to exist. The electronic keyboard delivered the final blow to what demand remained. Casio launched its first electronic keyboard, the Casio Tone CT201, in January 1980. Yamaha launched its Portasound range in December of the same year, compact, battery-powered, affordable, a fraction of the cost of an acoustic piano. In 1983, Yamaha launched the Clavinova, the first dedicated digital piano line. By the mid-1980s, cheap keyboards were ubiquitous in British homes. The idea that music making required a large, was expensive, regularly tuned acoustic instrument, the idea on which an entire industry and an entire culture of domestic music had been built, was collapsing. And the British industry's response to all of this, the Japanese Quality Revolution, the Korean Price War, the electronic keyboard explosion, was catastrophically inadequate. There was no significant government intervention, no protective tariffs, no industrial strategy, no equivalent of the support given to shipbuilding or automotive manufacturing. No parliamentary debate specifically addressed the piano industry's survival. The Music Industries Association existed as a trade body but lacked the influence to change policy. The Queen's Award for Export Achievement was granted to Kemble in 1992, by which point the company was already 90% owned by Yamaha. The factories of Camden and Islington were left to face a global manufacturing revolution, with Victorian methods, fragmented supply chains, and a domestic market that was evaporating beneath their feet. They faced it alone, and one by one, they fell. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. Brinsmead had fallen first in 1920. Collard & Collard ceased trading in 1929, sold to Chappell Piano Company. Pianos bearing the Collard name were produced until approximately 1960, but the Oval Road Rotunda fell silent. It was later occupied by Gilbey's Spirits before conversion to offices. Challen's trajectory was different, and more painful for being so. Under William Evans, who joined in 1926 and introduced modern production techniques to the family firm, Challen had thrived even as competitors failed. Annual output rose to 2,500 instruments through the 1930s. And Evans designed a 4-foot baby grand that nearly displaced the upright as the compact home instrument of choice. In 1932, Challen took over all manufacturing for Broadwood, which became retail only. But when Evans retired in 1959, the company was sold to the Brasted brothers, then passed to Barrett and Robinson in 1970, then to Broadwood in 1984. By 1986, the Challen name was being used by a Malaysian manufacturer under license. An estimated 90,000 Challen instruments survive in British homes, roughly 30,000 of them baby grands. But the company that built them had vanished through a succession of acquisitions that stripped the brand of its manufacturing identity. Each sale was presented as a rescue. Each rescue removed something essential. By the end, the name on the fullboard had no connection to the hands that had once shaped it. Daneman's collapse was particularly poignant. 3 generations of the family had built pianos of genuine distinction at the Islington Works, instruments that went to the Royal Festival Hall for its opening in 1951, to Harrods, to British embassies, to P&O cruise liners, to the Royal College of Music. Peter Daneman, Edgar's son, was the last family member to design pianos there. But the firm couldn't compete with Far East prices, and diminishing school budgets in the 1970s and 1980s eroded a crucial institutional market. Schools that had once bought British uprights, as a matter of course, now couldn't afford to replace the ones they had. In 1982, Tom Daneman sold the business to Broadwood. Even Broadwood couldn't make the Northampton Street premises profitable. In July 1984, and Islington Borough Council called in the official receiver over a £250,000 loan. The rights, designs and tooling were transported to Cardiff, where Gardner Pianos made approximately 350 Daneman instruments before ceasing production entirely in 1994. Tim Daneman, great-grandson of the founder, now runs a piano restoration business in Buckfastleigh. Devon. Back where the story started, Devon. A full circle that nobody wanted. Barrett and Robinson at Hermitage Road, Haringey, was one of the last London factories still operating in the early 1980s, producing about 7,000 pianos a year, roughly 95% uprights. They closed around 1985. The final act of consolidation played out at Woodchester Mills near Stroud. In 1993, Whelpdale, Maxwell and Codd, makers of Welmar pianos, acquired Bentley. In 2001, the surviving brands were gathered under a new entity, the British Piano Manufacturing Company Limited. Broadwood, Knight, Welmar, Bentley, Woodchester and Marshall & Rose, all under one roof. 6 names that had once represented 6 independent firms, 6 different approaches to the craft, 6 separate histories stretching back decades or centuries. Now huddled together in a single mill in Gloucestershire. It was a last stand. It lasted barely 2 years. On Monday, 7th of April 2003, the British Piano Manufacturing Company went into voluntary liquidation. Every brand ceased production simultaneously. 6 names silenced in a single day. Chapter 10. The Last Strings That Left Kemble. As the company Michael Kemble had founded in 1911 in Stoke Newington, the very last manufacturer to enter the trade before the First World War, was now the very last manufacturer still standing. Under Michael's son Robert, the company had moved to a purpose-built factory in Bletchley, near Milton Keynes in the 1950s. Robert ran it jointly with Denzel Jacobs, and the firm was entrepreneurial enough to become Yamaha's UK distributor in 1966, then its European manufacturing partner. It was a shrewd arrangement. Yamaha provided the global brand and the components. Kemble provided the British factory and the British workforce. For a time, it worked. In 1986, during the recession, Yamaha bought a 90% stake, effectively rescuing the company from the same fate that had consumed every other name in the trade. Brian Kemble, as the founder's grandson, Dinson, was appointed managing director and received an MBE for services to piano making. Under Yamaha's ownership, the Bletchley factory was transformed into one of Europe's most modern piano production facilities. Kemble became the only British piano company ever to receive the Queen's Award for Export Achievement. But by 2009, Yamaha had conducted a worldwide review and reached a conclusion that was arithmetically inescapable. British manufacturing costs could not compete with production in Indonesia. On April 30th, 2009, the closure was announced. 90 employees were made redundant. Brian Kemble told The Guardian it was the worst day of his life. It is a very sad day for my staff, the Kemble family, and for manufacturing in UK. During the 1980s recession, Yamaha rode to our rescue. And thanks to them, we have continued manufacturing for another 23 years. Then he added something with a craftsman's quiet, dark irony. We are a victim of our own success in that our pianos last too long. They stay in families for years. In October 2009, Brian Kemble personally completed the last 2 pianos to be manufactured in Britain. He put the last strings in the last piano himself. His uncle Stanley, who was 87, had also been in the business, his brother Andrew, his cousin Roy, 4 generations of the family, nearly a century of the firm, a grandson's hands performing the same stringing that his grandfather had done 98 years earlier. Then he switched off the lights. The last piano was designated to celebrate Chopin's bicentenary. Over its history, Kemble had produced 350,000 pianos, and owners included Lord Lloyd Webber, Tony Blair, Corinne Bailey Rae, and Coldplay. Production moved to Yamaha's Indonesian factory. In 2020, Yamaha ceased producing pianos under the Kemble brand entirely. The name joined the others: Brinsmead, Collard, Challen, Daneman, Knight, Bentley, Welmar, Broadwood, as a ghost. A word on a full board with no factory behind it. Chapter 11. The Piano Graveyards. Britain is drowning in unwanted pianos. The arithmetic is merciless. At peak, British factories produce 75,000 instruments a year. A well-made piano lasts a century or more. The cumulative stock in British homes grew for decades, even as annual production declined. Now, with acoustic piano sales in the UK estimated at roughly 5,000 per year, and digital pianos outselling acoustics by ratios approaching 10-1, the oversupply is overwhelming. An entire industry has emerged to deal with the surplus. Piano Disposal UK offers a nationwide service, charging from £125 for collection. Piano Recycling UK, run by a specialist called John at Piano Speed, charges £249 for uprights and £299 for grands. They'll accept working, overstrung pianos for free. Everything else costs money to destroy. Kent Piano Movers recovers wood and brass from unplayable instruments, fashioning art from the remains: bookcases, writing desks, wine cabinets. Every piano is dismantled with precision. Wood, metal, lead, and other materials are carefully separated. They recover cast iron frames, wooden casings, and even the small lead weights from inside every key. The economics are brutal. A technician's assessment costs £60 to £100. Tuning costs £60 or more per session, needed once or twice yearly, and many old instruments will not hold a tune regardless. Only 11% of UK councils will collect pianos. They're too heavy for standard waste collection. Most furniture charities, the British Heart Foundation, Emmaus, specifically refuse to accept pianos. Transport requires specialist equipment. Instruments weighing up to 500 kilograms will not fit through modern narrow doorways and stairwells. Full rebuilding costs thousands of pounds, typically exceeding the instrument's value. People only really want Steinway or Bechstein. The mass of old British uprights has essentially zero resale value. Then the pianos that Camden's craftsmen assembled from 2,500 parts over months of patient labour, that were seasoned for 7 years, polished by hand, tuned by ear, and sold to families who believed they were buying something that would last generations, are now objects nobody wants. They sit in spare rooms, in garages, in charity shop loading bays where they've been turned away. They appear on Gumtree and Facebook Marketplace listed as free to collector. The collector rarely comes. In the 1950s and 1960s, a peculiarly British tradition swept the country: piano smashing competitions. At village fêtes, on school playing fields, on football pitches, teams of men with sledgehammers, axes, hacksaws and crowbars would attack upright pianos and reduce them to debris. The wreckage had to pass through a 9-inch diameter hole, usually an old wooden toilet seat, to verify complete destruction. Britain eventually ran out of surplus pianos to smash. Guinness World Records has since retired the piano smashing category from active competition. A smashed piano from the 1966 Destruction in Art Symposium in Islington, barely a mile from where Daneman was still building them, was later exhibited at Tate Britain. An instrument that had taken months to build, displayed as rubble in a gallery. The meaning was supposed to be art. The meaning was also something else entirely. Against this tide, scattered rescue efforts persist. Pianodrome in Edinburgh, founded by Tim Vincent Smith and Matthew Wright, rescues abandoned pianos, refurbishes them for adoption, and converts irreparable instruments into art and furniture, including a 6-metre elephant tusk sculpture and an amphitheatre built entirely from upcycled pianos. Piano Equals, run by Miller's Music, places instruments in schools and community organisations, claiming that reusing a piano saves up to 97% of the carbon dioxide cost of importing a new one. These are valiant efforts. They are not remotely sufficient to the scale of the surplus. The craft of piano making is now classified as critically endangered on Britain's Heritage Crafts Red List, alongside horse collar making and fan making. The sole surviving British piano manufacturer, Cavendish Pianos, founded in 2012 by Adam Cox and his wife Charlie, operates from former cowsheds on the Bolton Abbey estate in the Yorkshire Dales. 8 craftspeople, and 3 technicians, a piano designer, a cabinet maker, a furniture maker, a string maker, and 1 apprentice. Average production time, 3 months per instrument. They use British oak, ash and walnut, British felts and cloths, hand-wound strings. Cox launched the company after the closure of Yamaha's Kemble factory. His reasoning was simple. There's been a history of piano making in the UK for about 200 years, and I always feel that if it stops happening, there'll be no one to teach, and there are so many things to know. If it was the end of that tradition, it would be tragic. He insists on the forward-looking framing. We're not the last piano maker in the UK, we're the first of a new generation. 8 people in converted cowsheds. 100 factories employing 6,000 people, reduced to 8 people in converted cowsheds. Meanwhile, in Shanghai, Cox observed Chinese manufacturers who had acquired English piano names and claimed an English heritage, complete with pictures of the Queen and double-decker buses. The ghost brands of Camden's Piano Quarter, Bentley, Challen, Brinsmead, live on as marketing fictions applied to instruments made thousands of miles from the factories where those names once meant something. The buildings endure. The Chapel factory in Chalk Farm, where pianos were built for Beethoven and Strauss, now sells apartments for £3.25 million to £8.5 million. Swimming pool, spa, club lounge. The Brinsmead works on Ryland Road were converted in 2012 into 9 flats and a penthouse. The Imperial Works on Perrin Street is now an 18,000 square foot commercial office space. The Rotunda on Oval Road, where 200 pianos burned in the fire of 1851, and where Collard subsequently produced 40 a week, houses what one local publication describes as a rather dull collection of offices. The Danaman Piano Works on Northampton Street was renamed as the Ivories, and now houses a business centre for small firms, a flute workshop, gyms, a children's therapy centre, and an artisan bakery. A pair of iron gates in the shape of 2 interlocking grand pianos was erected at the former goods entrance. The building's original features, enormous windows designed for maximum natural light on the workbench, wrought iron pillars, vaulted ceilings, exposed Victorian brickwork, are marketed as industrial chic. The estate agent's language is rich with heritage vocabulary. None of it mentions that what happened in these buildings was the making of pianos. A former piano factory near Regent's Canal now houses celebrity yoga studios. Clients include Kate Moss and Jude Law. On Fitzroy Road, the ornate Italianate portico with the piano-shaped gates still stands. It's local authority housing now. A tank of fresh water was discovered beneath the Primrose Hill Community Centre, originally used in the piano manufacturing process. Nobody knew it was there until they dug. There is a detail that stays with you. On Perrin Street, outside what was for a decade the headquarters of Rafa, the cycling clothing brand, steel tracks remain embedded in the cobblestones. They are the trackway where finished pianos were once lowered onto trolleys and rolled to Ryland Road for transport to the railways. Nobody who passes them daily knows what they are for. The tracks lead nowhere now. The factories are silent. But the buildings stand, and if you know what to look for, the enormous windows, the wrought iron pillars, the faded ghost signs on brick walls, the piano-shaped gates on Fitzroy Road, you can still trace the outline of an empire that once made music for the world. Britain built an industry on the idea that every home should make its own music. Then it abandoned both the industry and the idea. The pianos remain, unwanted, untuned, too heavy to move, and too beautiful to destroy. The last physical evidence of a time when a nation believed that making music together, in the parlour, by hand, was worth the effort. The silence is in the wrong shape. It's the shape of something that used to be there.